Ernest Dowson, a memoir by Arthur Symons. The death of Ernest Dowson will mean very little to the world at large, but it will mean a great deal to the few people who care passionately for poetry. A little book of verses, the manuscript of another, a one-act play in verse, a few short stories, 2 novels written in collaboration, some translations from the French, done for money. That is all that was left by a man who was undoubtedly a man of genius, not a great poet, but a poet. One of the very few writers of our generation to whom that name can be applied in its most intimate sense. People will complain, probably in his verses, of what will seem to them the factitious melancholy, the factitious idealism, and, peeping through at a few rare moments, the factitious suggestions of riot. They will see only a literary affectation, where in truth there is as genuine a note of personal sincerity as in the more explicit and arranged confessions of less admirable poets. Yes, in these few evasive, immaterial snatches of song, I find implied for the most part, hidden away like a secret, all the fever and turmoil of the unattained dreams of a life which had itself so much of the swift, disastrous, and suicidal impetus of genius. Ernest Christopher Dowson was born at the Grove, Belmont Hill, Lee, Kent, on August 2, 1867. He died at 26 Sandhurst Gardens, Catford, S.E., on Friday morning, February 23, 1900, and was buried in the Roman Catholic part of the Lewisham Cemetery on February 27th. His great-uncle was Alfred Domett, Browning's quote-unquote Waring, at one time Prime Minister of New Zealand and author of Ranulph and Amohia and other poems. His father, who had himself a taste for literature, lived a good deal in France and on the Riviera on account of the delicacy of his health, and Ernest had a somewhat irregular education, chiefly out of England before he entered Queen's College, Oxford. He left in 1887 without taking a degree, and came to London, where he lived for several years, often revisiting France, which was always his favorite country. Latterly, until the last year of his life, he lived almost entirely in Paris, Brittany, and Normandy. Never robust, and always reckless with himself, his health had been steadily getting worse for some years, and when he came back to London, he looked, as indeed he was, a dying man. Morbidly shy, with a sensitive independence which shrank from any sort of obligation, he would not communicate with his relatives, who would have gladly helped him, or with any of the really large number of attached friends whom he had in London, and as his disease weakened him more and more, he hid himself away in his miserable lodgings, refused to see a doctor, let himself half starve, and was found one day in a bodega with only a few shillings in his pocket, and so weak as to be hardly able to walk, by a friend himself in some difficulties, who immediately took him back to the bricklayer's cottage in a muddy outskirt of Catford, where he was himself living, and there generously looked after him for the last 6 weeks of his life. He did not realize that he was going to die, and was full of projects for the future. When the £600, which was to come to him from the sale of some property, should have given him a fresh chance in the world, began to read Dickens, whom he had never read before, with singular zest, and on the last day of his life sat up talking eagerly till 5 in the morning. At the very moment of his death, he did not know that he was dying. He tried to cough, could not cough, and the heart quietly stopped. I cannot remember my first meeting with Ernest Dowson. It may have been in 1891 at one of the meetings of the Rhymers' Club in an upper room of the Cheshire Cheese, where long clay pipes lay in slim heaps on the wooden tables between tankards of ale, and young poets, then very young, recited their own verses to one another with a desperate and ineffectual attempt to get into key with the Latin Quarter. Though few of us were, as a matter of fact, Anglo-Saxon, we could not help feeling that we were in London, and the atmosphere of London is not the atmosphere of movements or of societies. In Paris, it is the most natural thing in the world to meet and discuss literature, ideas, one's own and one another's work, and it can be done without pretentiousness or constraint, because, to the Latin mind, art, ideas, one's work, and the work of one's friends are definite and important things, which it would never occur to anyone to take anything but seriously. In England, art has to be protected, not only against the world, but against one's self and one's fellow artist, by a kind of affected modesty, which is the Englishman's natural pose, half pride and half self-distrust. So this brave venture of the Rhymers' Club, though it lasted for 2 or 3 years, and produced 2 little books of verse, which will someday be literary curiosities, was not quite satisfactory, kind of a cynical. Dowson, who enjoyed the real thing so much in Paris, did not, I think, go very often, but his contributions to the first book of the club were at once the most delicate and the most distinguished poems which it contained. Was it, after all, at one of these meetings that I first saw him, or was it perhaps at another haunt of some of us at that time, a semi-literary tavern near Leicester Square, chosen for its convenient position between 2 stage doors? It was at the time when 1 or 2 of us sincerely worshipped the ballet. Dowson, alas, never. I could never get him to see that charm in harmonious and colored movement, like bright shadows seen through the floating gauze of the music, which held me night after night at the 2 theaters, which alone seemed to me to give an amusing color to one's dreams. Neither the stage nor the stage door had any attraction for him, but he came to the tavern because it was a tavern, and because he could meet his friends there. Even before that time, I have a vague impression of having met him. I forget where, certainly at night, and having been struck even then by a look and manner of pathetic charm, a sort of Keats-like face, the face of a demoralized Keats, and by something curious in the contrast of a manner exquisitely refined, with an appearance generally somewhat dilapidated. That impression was only accentuated later on when I came to know him, and the manner of his life much more intimately. I think I may date my first impression of what one calls the real man, as if it were more real than the poet of the disembodied verses, from an evening in which he first introduced me to those charming supper-houses, open all night through, the cabmen's shelters. I had been talking over another vagabond poet, Lord Rochester, with a charming and sympathetic descendant of that poet, and somewhat late at night we had come upon Dowson and another man wandering aimlessly and excitedly about the streets. He invited us to supper. We did not quite realize where, and the cabman came in with us, as we were welcomed cordially and without comment at a little place near the Langham, and I recollect very hospitably entertained. The cooking differs, as I found in time, in these supper-houses, but there the rasher was excellent and the cups admirably clean. Dowson was known there, and I used to think he was always at his best in a cabman's shelter. Without a certain sordidness in his surroundings, he was never quite comfortable, never quite himself, and at those places you are obliged to drink nothing stronger than coffee or tea. I liked to see him occasionally, for a change, drinking nothing stronger than coffee or tea. At Oxford, I believe his favorite form of intoxication had been hashish. Afterwards, he gave up this somewhat elaborate experiment in visionary sensations for readier means of oblivion. But he returned to it, I remember, for at least one afternoon, in a company of which I had been the gatherer, and of which I was the host. I remember him sitting a little anxiously with his chin on his breast, awaiting the magic, half shy in the midst of a bright company of young people whom he had only seen across the footlights. The experience was not a very successful one. It ended in what should have been its first symptom, immoderate laughter. Always, perhaps a little consciously, but at least always sincerely, in search of new sensations, my friend found what was for him the supreme sensation in a very passionate and tender adoration of the most escaping of all ideals, the ideal of youth. Cherished, as I imagine, first only in the abstract, this search after the immature the ripening graces which time can only spoil in the ripening, found itself at the journey's end, as some of his friends thought, a little prematurely. I was never of their opinion. I only saw twice, and for a few moments only, the young girl to whom most of his verses were to be written, and whose presence in his life may be held to account for much of that astonishing contrast between the broad outlines of his life and work. The situation seemed to me of the most exquisite and appropriate impossibility. The daughter of a refugee, I believe of good family, reduced to keeping a humble restaurant in a foreign quarter of London, she listened to his verses, smiled charmingly under her mother's eyes on his 2 years' courtship, and at the end of 2 years married the waiter instead. Did she ever realize more than the obvious part of what was being offered to her in this shy and eager devotion? Did it ever mean very much to her to have made and to have killed a poet? She had at all events the gift of evoking, and in its way of retaining all that was most delicate, sensitive, shy, typically poetic in a nature which I can only compare to a weedy garden, its grass trodden down by many feet, but with one small, carefully tended flower bed, luminous with lilies. I used to think sometimes of Verlaine and his girl wife, the one really profound passion, certainly of that passionate career. The charming, childlike creature to whom he looked back at the end of his life with an unchanged tenderness and disappointment. "You don't understand anything about simplicity," as he lamented. In the case of Dowson, however, there was a sort of virginal devotion, as to a Madonna, and I think had things gone happily to a conventional happy ending, he would have felt, dare I say, that his ideal had been spoiled. But for the good fortune of poets, things rarely go happily with them, or to conventionally happy endings. He used to dine every night at the little restaurant, and I can always see the picture, which I have so often seen through the window in passing, the narrow room with rough tables, for the most part empty, except in the innermost corner, where Dowson would sit with that singularly sweet and singularly pathetic smile on his lips, a smile which seemed afraid of its right to be there, as if always dreading a rebuff, playing his invariable after-dinner game of cards. Friends would come in during the hour before closing time, and the girl, her game of cards finished, would quietly disappear, leaving him with hardly more than the desire to kill another night as swiftly as possible. Meanwhile, she and the mother knew that the fragile young man who dined there so quietly every day was apt to be quite another sort of person after he had been 3 hours outside. It was only when his life seemed to have been irretrievably ruined that Dowson quite deliberately abandoned himself to that craving for drink, which was doubtless lying in wait for him in his blood, as consumption was also. It was only latterly, when he had no longer any interest in life, that he really wished to die. But I have never known him when he could resist either the desire or the consequences of drink. Sober, he was the most gentle, in manner the most gentlemanly of men, unselfish to a fault, to the extent of weakness, a delightful companion, charm itself. Under the influence of drink, he became almost literally insane, certainly quite irresponsible. He fell into furious and unreasoning passions. A vocabulary unknown to him at other times sprang up like a whirlwind. He seemed always about to commit some act of absurd violence. Along with that forgetfulness came other memories. As long as he was conscious of himself, there was but one woman for him in the world, and for her he had an infinite tenderness and an infinite respect. When that face faded from him, he saw all other faces, and he saw no more difference than between sheep and sheep. Indeed, that curious love of the sordid, so common an affectation of the modern decadent, and with him so genuine, grew upon him and dragged him into more and more sorry corners of a life which was never exactly gay to him. His father, when he died, left him in possession of an old dock, where for a time he lived in a mouldering house, in that squalid part of the East End which he came to know so well, and to feel so strangely at home in. He drank the poisonous liquors of those pot-houses which swarm about the docks. He drifted about in whatever company came in his way. He let heedlessness develop into a curious disregard of personal tidiness. In Paris, Les Halles took the place of the docks. At Dieppe, where I saw so much of him one summer, he discovered strange, squalid haunts about the harbor, where he made friends with amazing innkeepers, and got into rows with the fishermen who came in to drink after midnight. At Brussels, where I was with him at the time of the Kermesse, he flung himself into all that riotous Flemish life, with a zest for what was most sordidly riotous in it. It was his own way of escape from life. To Dowson, as to all those who have not been content to ask unlikely gifts in vain, nature, life, destiny, whatever one chooses to call it, that power which is strength to the strong, presented itself as a barrier against which all one's strength only served to dash one more to hopeless ruin. He was not a dreamer. Destiny passes by the dreamer, sparing him because he clamors for nothing. He was a child clamoring for so many things, all impossible. With a body too weak for ordinary existence, he desired all the enchantments of all the senses. With a soul too shy to tell its own secret, except in exquisite evasions, he desired the boundless confidence of love. He sang one tune over and over, and no one listened to him. He had only to form the most simple wish, and it was denied him. He gave way to ill luck, not knowing that he was giving way to his own weakness, and he tried to escape from the consciousness of things as they were at the best by voluntarily choosing to accept them at their worst. For with him it was always voluntary. He was never quite without money. He had a little money of his own, and he had for many years a weekly allowance from a publisher in return for translations from the French, or if he chose to do it, original work. He was unhappy, and dared not to think. To unhappy men, thought, if it can be set at work on abstract questions, is the only substitute for happiness. If it has not strength to overleap the barrier which shuts one in upon oneself, it is the one unwearying torture. Dowson had exquisite sensibility. He vibrated in harmony with every delicate emotion. But he had no outlook. He had not the escape of intellect. His only escape, then, was to plunge into the crowd, to fancy that he lost sight of himself as he disappeared from the sight of others. The more he soiled himself at that gross contact, the further would he seem to be from what beckoned to him in one vain illusion after another vain illusion, in the delicate places of the world. Seeing himself moving to the sound of lutes in some courtly disguise down an alley of Watteau's Versailles, while he touched fingertips with the divine creature in rose-leaf silks, what was there left for him, as the dream obstinately refused to realize itself, but a blind flight into some Tenier's kitchen, where boors are making merry, without thought of yesterday or tomorrow? There, perhaps, in that ferment of animal life, he could forget life as he dreamed it, with too faint hold upon his dreams to make dreams come true. For there is not a dream which may not come true if we have the energy which makes or chooses our own fate. We can always in this world get what we want, if we will it intensely and persistently enough. Whether we shall get it sooner or later is the concern of fate, but we shall get it. It may come whenever we have no longer any use for it, when we have gone on willing it out of habit, or so as not to confess that we have failed. But it will come. So few people succeed greatly because so few people can conceive a great end, and work towards that end without deviating and without tiring. But we all know that the man who works for money, day and night, gets rich, and the man who works day and night for no matter what kind of material power, gets the power. It is the same with the deeper, more spiritual, as it seems vaguer issues, which makes for happiness and every intangible success. It is only the dreams of those light sleepers who dream faintly that do not come true. We get out of life, all of us, what we bring to it. That, and that only, is what it can teach us. There are men whom Dowson's experiences would have made great men or great writers. For him, they did very little. Love and regret, with here and there the suggestion of an uncomforting pleasure snatched by the way, are all that he has to sing of, and he could have sung of them at much less expense of spirit, and, one fancies, without the waste of shame at all. Think what Villon got directly out of his own life, what Verlaine, what Musset, what Byron got directly out of their own lives. It requires a strong man to sin strongly and profit by it. To Dowson, the tragedy of his own life could only have resulted in an elegy. I have flung roses, roses riotously with the throng, he confesses in his most beautiful poem. But it was as one who flings roses in a dream as he passes with shut eyes through an unsubstantial throng. The depths into which he plunged were always waters of oblivion, and he returned forgetting them. He is always a very ghostly lover, wandering in a land of perpetual twilight, as he holds a whispered colloque sentimental with the ghost of an old love. In the old park, solitary and icy, two spectres evoke the past. It was indeed almost a literal unconsciousness, as of one who leads two lives, severed from one another as completely as sleep is from waking. Thus we get in his work very little of the personal appeal of those to whom riotous living, misery, a cross destiny have been of so real a value. And it is important to draw this distinction, if only for the benefit of those young men who are convinced that the first step towards genius is disorder. Dowson is precisely one of the people who are pointed out as confirming this theory, and yet Dowson was precisely one of those who owed least to circumstances, and in succumbing to them he did no more than succumb to the destructive forces which, shut up within him, pulled down the house of life upon his own head. A soul unspotted from the world, in a body which one sees visibly soiling under one's eyes, that in probability is what all who knew him saw in Dowson, as his youthful physical grace gave way year by year, and the personal charm underlying it remained unchanged. There never was a simpler or more attaching charm, because there never was a sweeter or more honest nature. It was not because he ever said anything particularly clever or particularly interesting. It was not because he gave you ideas or impressed you by any strength or originality that you liked to be with him, but because of a certain engaging quality, which seemed unconscious of itself, which was never anxious to be or to do anything, which simply existed as perfume exists in a flower. Drink was like a heavy curtain, blotting out everything of a sudden. When the curtain lifted, nothing had changed. Living always that double life, he had his true and his false aspect, and the true life was the expression of that fresh, delicate, and uncontaminated nature which some of us knew in him, and which remains for us untouched by the other in every line that he wrote. Dowson was the only poet I ever knew who cared more for his prose than his verse, but he was wrong, and it is not by his prose that he will live, exquisite as that prose was at its best. He wrote 2 novels in collaboration with Mr. Arthur Moore, A Comedy of Masks in 1893, and Adrian Rome in 1899, both done under influence of Mr. Henry James, both interesting because they were personal studies and studies of known surroundings, rather than for their actual value as novels. A volume of stories and studies and sentiment called Dilemmas, in which the influence of Mr. Wedmore was felt in addition to the influence of Mr. James, appeared in 1895. Several other short stories, among his best work in prose, have not been reprinted from the Savoy. Some translations from the French done as hack work need not be mentioned here, though they were never without some traces of his peculiar quality of charm in language. The short stories were indeed rather studies in sentiment than stories, studies of singular delicacy, but with only a faint hold on life, so that perhaps the best of them was not unnaturally a study in the approaches of death. The Dying of Francis Dawn. For the most part, they dealt with the same motives as the poems: hopeless and reverent love, the ethics of renunciation, the disappointment of those who were too weak or too unlucky to take what they desire. They have a sad and quiet beauty of their own, the beauty of second thoughts and subdued emotions, of choice and scholarly English, moving in the more fluid and reticent harmonies of prose almost as daintily as if it were moving to the measure of verse. Dowson's care over English prose was like that of a Frenchman writing his own language with respect with Frenchmen paid to French. Even English things had to come to him through France, if he was to prize them very highly. And there is a passage in Dilemmas which I have always thought very characteristic of his own tastes, as it refers to an infinitesimal library, a few French novels, a Horace, and some well-thumbed novels of the modern English poets in the familiar edition Tauchnitz. He was Latin by all his affinities, and that very quality of slightness, of parsimony almost in his dealings with life and the substance of art, connects him with the artists of Latin races, who have always been so fastidious in the rejection of mere nature, when it comes too nakedly or too clamorously into sight and hearing, and so gratefully content with the few choice things faultlessly done. And Dowson, in his verse, the verses of 1896, the Pierrot of the Minute, a dramatic fantasy in one act of 1897, the posthumous volume Decorations, was the same scrupulous artist as in his prose, and more felicitously at home there. He was quite Latin in his feeling for youth and death, and the old age of roses, and the pathos of our little hour in which to live and love. Latin in his elegance, reticence and simple grace in the treatment of these motives, Latin finally in his sense of their sufficiency for the whole of one's mental attitude. He used the commonplaces of poetry frankly, making them his own by his belief in them. The Horatian Chimera, or Neobul, was still the natural symbol for him when he wished to be most personal. I remember his saying to me that his ideal of a line of verse was the line of Poe, the viol, the violet, and the vine. And the gracious, not remote or unreal beauty which clings about such words and such images as these was always to him the true poetical beauty. There never was a poet to whom verse came more naturally, for the song's sake. His theories were all aesthetic, almost technical ones, such as a theory indicated by his preference for the line of Poe, that the letter V was the most beautiful of the letters, and could never be brought into verse too often. For any more abstract theories, he had neither tolerance nor need. Poetry, as a philosophy, did not exist for him. It existed solely as the loveliest of the arts. He loved the elegance of Horace, all that was most complex in the simplicity of Poe, most bird-like in the human melodies of Verlaine. He had the pure lyric gift, unweighted or unballasted by any other quality of mind or emotion, and a song for him was music first, and then whatever you please afterwards, so long as it suggested, never told, some delicate sentiment, a sigh or a caress, finding words at times as perfect as the words of a poem headed, "O death, how bitter is your memory to the man who has peace in his possessions." There surely the music of silence speaks, if it has ever spoken. The word seems to tremble back into silence which their whisper has interrupted, but not before they have created for us a mood, such a mood as the Venetian pastoral of Giorgione renders in painting. Languid, half inarticulate, coming from the heart of a drowsy sorrow very conscious of itself, and not less sorrowful because it sees its own face looking mournfully back out of the water. The song seems to have been made by some fastidious amateur of grief, and it is all the sighs and tremors of the mood, wrought into a faultless strain of music. Stepping out of a paradise in which pain becomes so lovely, He can see the beauty which is the other side of madness, and in a sonnet to one in Bedlam can create a more positive, a more poignant mood with fine subtlety. Here, in the moment's intensity of his comradeship with madness, observe how beautiful the whole thing becomes, how instinctively the imagination of the poet turns what is sordid into a radiance, all stars and flowers and the divine part of forgetfulness. It is a symbol of the two sides of his own life, the side open to the street and the side turned away from it, where he could hush and bless himself with silence. No one ever worshipped beauty more devoutly, and just as we see him here transfiguring a dreadful thing with beauty, so we shall see, everywhere in his work, that he never admitted an emotion which he could not so transfigure. He knew his limits only too well. He knew that the deeper and graver things of life were for the most part outside the circle of his magic. He passed them by, leaving much of himself unexpressed, because he would not permit himself to express nothing imperfectly, or according to anything but his own conception of the dignity of poetry. In the lyric in which he has epitomized himself and his whole life, a lyric which is certainly one of the greatest lyrical poems of our time, I am not what I was under the reign of Canara. He has for once said everything, and he has said it to an intoxicating and perhaps immortal music. Here, perpetuated by some unique energy of a temperament rarely so much the master of itself, is the song of passion and the passions at their eternal war in the soul which they quicken or deaden, and in the body which they break down between them. In the second book, the Book of Decorations, there are a few pieces which repeat, only more faintly, this very personal note. Dowson could never have developed, he had already said in his first book of verse, all that he had to say. Had he lived, had he gone on writing, he could only have echoed himself, and probably it would have been the less essential part of himself, his obligation to Swinburne, always evident, increasing as his own inspiration failed him. He was always without ambition, writing to please his own fastidious taste, with a kind of proud humility in his attitude towards the public, not expecting or requiring recognition. He died obscure, having ceased to care even for the delightful labor of writing. He died young, worn out by what was never really life to him, leaving a little verse which was the pathos of things too young and too frail ever to grow old. Arthur Symons, 1900.